Hi. The American writer and poet Edgar Allan Poe thought that Appalachia would have been a much better name for his country than America, but the idea didn't catch on. However, it's fitting that Poe, the master of American Gothic, should feel an affinity with a region that has come to occupy a position in the US Imaginarium as a place of backwardness and atavistic evil. Since the Civil War, the Appalachian region and its people have historically been stereotyped as backwards, rural, and anti-progressive. In popular culture, from TV shows like the Beverly Hillbillies and the movie Deliverance, to more contemporary fictions such as Ozark, Hillbilly Elegy, and Demon Copperhead, we see these stereotypes occasionally confronted, but more often reconfirmed. So how can we get beyond the stereotypes and hear voices from the real communities of the region? Or perhaps podcasting is part of the answer. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power.
Knowledge.
Education.
My guest this time researched podcasters in the Appalachian region as part of her master's at the University of Edinburgh. Hailing from the north of the United States rather than from the Appalachian region itself, she wanted to get beyond the stereotypes she had grown up with and research what grassroots digital media in the shape of podcasting is doing to give authentic voices of Appalachia an audience. Kate Fitzgerald, head of FACT. Who the hell is she?
Hack Facts.
Brigid McCormack is a podcast producer and researcher and has recently been appointed as content coordinator at Assemble U. She holds a master's degree from the University of Edinburgh's Futures Institute, where she explored narrative futures and the intersection of technology with storytelling. Her academic research focused on podcasting in the Appalachian region of the United States, examining how this medium is used to challenge negative stereotypes and preserve the rich cultural heritage of Appalachia. Through her limited series podcast, Pods and Prose, Brigid engaged with Appalachian writers and podcasters to highlight local narratives and promote oral storytelling.
I was very pleased to recommend Brigid to friend of the podcast Adam Lacey of Assemble U, where she now helps him with his own podcast. Those of a more competitive disposition might call that fattening frogs for snakes in Hillbilly argot. But call me a victim of the woke mind virus, I think there's room for all of us. Anyway, it was obvious that a sharp mind like Brigid's would be a real asset for the wider cause of learning podcasts. I also thought her research was fascinating, and I'm really pleased now to be able to bring it to listeners of The Learning Hack with this interview. It makes some really interesting points about the power of podcasts for learning. So Brigid, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome to The Learning Hack.
Thank you, John. Happy to be here.
So first of all, congratulations on your new job with Assemble U. We'll talk about your work on learning podcasts with Assemble U later. But for most of this episode, I want to focus on your academic work on podcasting in the Appalachian region of the US. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I know that it makes a difference. I should explain for the listeners that the idea for this episode came out of a conversation we had well before you went to work with Adam. Can you tell us briefly about that research work? What was it? How did it come about?
Yeah, so I'm from America. I'm from north of Chicago, but I'm based in Edinburgh, Scotland. And so I did my master's with the University of Edinburgh's Futures Institute, studying narrative futures, which essentially meant what are the stories, what are the conversations, what does communication look like in the future, particularly looking at how tech is involved with it. How does tech change the way we communicate and talk? And so I wanted to explore what conversations are going on? What are we preserving through tech? What kind of digital archive are creating with humans and with stories? And I'm intrigued by the Appalachian region. You can say Appalachia or Appalachia, either way, because it's such a rich subculture within America that not even all Americans are familiar with and know about. But it's also home to a lot of negative stereotypes, such as hillbillies and rednecks, and kind of those stereotypes that really hurt kind of the American reputation, I suppose, in that way. So I was just curious about what conversations are being had with people that live in the region. What are they talking about? And how are they talking about it on podcasting in particular? Because podcasting is such a open medium, accessible medium that so many people use. And I wanted to see how that was being used to talk about this cultural region.
Can you tell us more about the Appalachian region for people outside North America who won't necessarily know that?
Yeah, so the Appalachian region, it covers 13 states, all the way from the bottom of New York to the top of Mississippi. So it runs across state lines following that Appalachian mountain range. And historically, it was settled by the Scots and the Irish and Germans in the early 1700s. And there's, of course, already an existing indigenous population there as well. And then later, there was a lot of runaway slaves that existed in the region. And all of this kind of layered history led to a really rich cultural region of strong folklore, strong music from bluegrass to gospel and country music. And then it was a really rich coal mining region as well because of the mountain range there. But that was, kind of used and abused, and there's a lot of economic overexpansion. And people who lived in Appalachia were kind of then suffering because of it. And there was a lot of poverty-stricken communities, deprivation in health, a lot of drug addiction, and now today still problems like that, and digital poverty as well. So it's a region where the people didn't really have a voice of their own. They were kind of told who they were. They were often painted in this light of these negative stereotypes. Rednecks, hillbillies, those came about, kind of in the 1950s, 60s, when TV show and media would kind of promote those stereotypes. But it's still rich with culture. It's a beautiful landscape and region. And yeah, very strong storytelling history, a really big part of kind of Americana.
Let's talk a little bit about the stereotypes and the associated with that region. And this will make it a bit more familiar, I think, for listeners from outside the UK, because we know about representations of this area in popular culture. The Beverly Hillbillies on TV, for people of my vintage who remember that. The film Deliverance, Dukes of Hazzard, The Waltons, again, people from the 70s will recognise that. Coal Miner's Daughter, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which kind of hints at the kind of a lot of the gothic kind of area that in literature and films and so on that's attached to that area when it comes to sort of American Gothic horror and so on will be familiar to people. That thing of atavistic evil. Silence of the Lambs, Clarice was from the Appalachians, I think. Ozark. These are kind of hillbillies. This is a Netflix series, and from an area, Ozark, which is kind of lumped in with this a lot, I think. More recently, Hillbilly Elegy and J.D. Vance, whether or not you kind of are really particularly approving of J.D. Vance's politics or not. And Demon Copperhead, maybe one more for the liberal bubble, talks about this image as well. Can you talk a bit about what made you want to pursue this subject area in particular, coming perhaps out of your own background?
Yeah, I mean, just you mentioning all of those different things, all of those different cultural references and media pieces on Appalachia was a huge part of why I kind of wanted to explore it. Because again, I'm not from the region, I'm from north of Chicago. So it was something that I was even detached from as an American. It was something I witnessed when I was, growing up. One of my favorite movies was I was a huge Elvis movie fan, which is probably kind of embarrassing, but he has a
Yeah.
movie that's horrible called Kissing Cousins. And it's just littered with, it's exactly what you think it is, just stupid Elvis movie, but it's littered with these stereotypes. But I grew up loving it when I was a kid. And then also, moving abroad, I've heard kind of every American comment in the book at this point, living abroad for a few years. And so I was just curious as to where does the narrative overlap? Where do these dominant narratives, these mainstream narratives that are held as truths, overlap with counter narratives, which are the kind of, the undercurrent, the people that are actually living, experiencing, and their stories. How do these overlap? And what do Appalachians actually think of these stories? So you mentioned like Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. That book is very contentious within the Appalachian community, and it has high critique, but it's also, some people love it, some people hate it. Again, Appalachia is a 13-state region. It's a huge population. So there's a lot of different ways to be Appalachian too. So there's no like one truth of being Appalachian, but there's so many projected truths out there through these, kind of narratives and these like hillbilly, Beverly Hillbillies and things like that. So I was just wanting to poke at it and see what do people say? What do people from the region actually talk about? What do they believe about themselves? What are they wanting to tell others through podcasting? Yeah.
Of course, a lot of people in the liberal bubble will, like myself, will make a blanket assumption this is MAGA territory. But tell us about the podcasts you looked at, the themes and formats that they covered.
Yeah. So for this project, for this research, I wanted to make a podcast about podcasting. So then I found 4 podcasts, 5 podcasters making 4 podcasts, and I interviewed them on a podcast. I'm saying podcast, wow, so many times. But one podcast in particular was called Appodlachia, and that's by Chuck Corra. And he does a fantastic job at having kind of a critical, viewpoint and looking at the politics and the current landscape of just the economic situation and politics that are going on across Appalachia. I believe he's based in West Virginia too, which is the only state that's completely enveloped in Appalachia. And that's Central Appalachia and parts of Kentucky. Those are kind of like the heart and soul of Appalachia. So he took an approach to podcasting where he's directly, his current podcasts are talking all about J.D. Vance, and kind of breaking that down and what he's about and what, different laws being passed in different regions and states, where other podcasts, such as Gabe and Cody, who made What's Appalachian, it was more of you're a fly in the wall. You can hear them crack open a beer at the beginning of their podcast, and they're just talking about their days, their weeks. And while that might not be them directly addressing or directly, making some intentional comments about politics, just their conversations about their days or weeks are inherently political, inherently addressing Appalachia struggles and Appalachia change right now. Yeah.
That's so interesting. So when I did a search on Apple Podcasts for Appalachia, first thing that came up was something called Old Gods of Appalachia by Deep Nerd Media. In the mountains of central Appalachia, blood runs as deep as these hollers and just as dark. And that kind of gives you a flavour. It's sort of true crime, atavistic evil in them hollers, and so on. Seems to be more about reinforcing the stereotypes, whereas the ones that you're talking about seem to be taking a more contemporary, thoughtful and discursive sort of view. So who is making these podcasts? Why are they doing it? Did you dig into the motivations? What are they trying to do with them?
Yeah, so that's a great podcast that you just mentioned. It's really good. There's so many good podcasts out there about Appalachia that are also just addressing the folklore of it. Because Appalachia is so rich in folklore and history. And so there's more kind of storied podcasts like that are doing more fictional kind of storytelling. But I particularly, for my research, was looking intentionally for podcasts that are talking about being Appalachian and talking about what it means to be, a person of this cultural region. But it runs the gamut in terms of even within the 4 podcasts that I looked at of what they wanted to talk about and what their angle was. So again, I mentioned Appodlachia by Chuck, and he was more, took the political angle and wanted to critically look at what the landscape of Appalachia looks like in terms of politics, economics, things like that. Now Appalachia by Elliot Parker was a lot more of telling the stories and also touching on the political kind of sphere and just what's going on with Appalachia in that way. What's Appalachian was, again, between 2 friends, a podcast that's just much more casual and conversational. And Appalachian Imagination by Jason was also kind of conversational. He'd have his local friends on. He would meet somebody at a local store and he'd ask them to be on his podcast. But all of them generally still have that kind of you're a fly in the wall approach. You're listening to candid, spontaneous conversation. You're also then taking in the accents, the tone, the speed, which is so important to Appalachia and to understanding a story effectively. And so many of them were also making these podcasts, not with grand ideas of, I'm going to change the world, but they're making it for their communities too. So many of their listener base are their friends and family, are people locally. They, would get recognized at their local supermarket sometimes, one of them told me. So while they're not trying to change the world and change how everybody sees Appalachia, they see themselves more as doing their part by just discussing it and having these candid conversations and recording it and putting it out there.
What did you learn about Appalachia from listening? We'll talk about the general conclusions you came to afterwards. But first of all, what did you learn about this region from this work, and what surprised you?
Yeah, I feel it's interesting because I didn't know much about the region, or what I did know, I knew from the stereotypes. And it was really special to have these conversations with these people and talk about their own experiences. I think one thing that really resonated with me was how frustrated that they all were by the stereotypes that are out there, and how much they still carry the history and the struggles of Appalachia today. Being an Appalachian in the 21st century, particularly if you're from kind of the rural areas in Appalachia, as some of these podcasters were in like West Virginia, areas of Kentucky, if they kind of venture outside of that region and they understand that they are put in this box, and they understand that their accents are very heavy and that there's certain, ideas around Southern accents as well. And so a lot of them just carry that frustration of this Appalachian stereotype that has been going on since the 1800s, really. But they're also very resilient. And some people, wear the term hillbilly or redneck with a badge of honor. And they're kind of trying to rebrand it. Chuck, again, from Appodlachia said, I think his logo or his motto for his podcast is shrewd, smart hillbilly. And a lot of these people are trying to say you can be both. You can be proud of your Appalachian heritage. You can be, rural, and you can be living in the country. You can be Appalachian, and you can still be smart, and you can be not racist, not ignorant, not homophobic. And so many of them also shared, Appalachians that they also consume, or, writers and artists. And it's a rich storytelling place. So there's so many artists that are coming out of it. So they're resilient still. They're trying to actively combat and gather pride in their Appalachian heritage and want other people to see that.
Yeah, coming back to sort of the question about formats, what sort of were they all discussions, the ones that you focused in on, or were there kind of first person monologues? Were there like wider groups? How did they break down in that way?
In the podcasts?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Chuck he's had a couple of different co-hosts with him, but he'll have guests on there. So often it was him discussing with guests. And Elliot Parker's, now Appalachia, his was just him. So it was just a solo one. And it was hard to find like women podcasters, for example. In terms of when I was looking and researching and just Googling and trying to find Appalachian podcasters to talk to, I wanted to get a variety, but I also wanted to get ones that were directly addressing being Appalachian. So it limited my choices a little bit. But and then Gabe and Cody from What's Appalachian, it was just the two of them. I think they'd occasionally have a guest on, but it's just the two of them having conversations together after work on one of their porches. And Jason Bowman, who did Appalachian Imagination, it would sometimes be him speaking solo, but often him with a guest too. So often most of them were conversational based. Yeah.
What sort of lengths were they? Short or long?
I think varied from 20 minutes to 45 to an hour, I think. Yeah. And a lot of them didn't necessarily have, a formula to their podcast. When speaking to them, it was an outlet for them. It's something of a hobby. It's something for them to do that they don't want to think too much about. It's more of a relaxation thing. And so a lot of them just, again, as I mentioned, would podcast kind of for the local community. So it would go as long as it needed to. I'd say, yeah, it varied in length and kind of style. Generally felt very casual and accessible.
Did you get much of a sense of what sort of audiences these people are getting and whether there's some kind of interaction with the audience? Did they have Q&As and so on?
Yeah, that was one of my questions when I created the podcast interviewing them. I asked them that, and a lot of them, it was interactions with their local community or it was people within Appalachia. And some of them would take, the podcast like Spotify data and look. And a few of them told me how they were surprised someone in Bangladesh was a listener. They get the odd, international listener. I'm sure they saw for me, they saw Scotland pop up and things like that. So they would get really excited when they'd see international listeners. But so many of them, it was more about connecting with their community. And that can be just literally their local community, or that can just be Appalachia. One of them told me a story of how he got recognized by his voice when he was volunteering at a local event. And that, I think meant more to him than how many listeners they have. They weren't too concerned with numbers. Again, it was more of a passion and a hobby to break down what it means to be Appalachian to Appalachians.
The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. What conclusions did you draw from this work?
Yeah, so within this work, I wanted to explore how the Appalachian narratives are being used in podcasting and what these Appalachian podcasters think of these dominant narratives of stereotypes and these counter narratives. And from what I found in terms of podcasting is it's an extremely powerful tool that can capture spontaneous conversation and candid conversation. And that is a much more accessible and approachable form of story than something that is written. So the fact that it's sonic, it's out loud, means that you're engaging with the accent, you're engaging with the tone, you're engaging with the candor, you're getting all parts of it. And that's connecting into ancient tradition of oral storytelling that exists across cultures. So my conclusions in my research was podcasting is just so powerful as a tool and so powerful as a way to be used as a platform to discuss, dominant narratives and counter narratives. And these Appalachian podcasters are just one of many. There's other people in different cultural regions, subregions, in different areas that are doing the same thing, that they're just trying to talk about their heritage. They're trying to talk about their existence and put it out there into just kind of the pod sphere and see who picks up on it. But often it's about engaging with your local community, talking about, okay, who are we? What does this mean to us? What does our past mean to us? That was what I think is so beautiful about podcasting as a medium, is that it's so accessible for that, especially in a place that has a lot of digital poverty and poverty in general, such as Appalachia. The fact that podcasting is such an easy medium for them to use to discuss these narratives and hopefully, break down these stereotypes. It's a really powerful tool, and these podcasters are doing a wonderful job of using podcasting well.
Yeah. But one of the interesting things about this, I suppose, is, well, podcasting is sort of a global medium. Once you open up your podcast, anyone can come and listen to it. And, on the Learning Hat, we have listeners in 130 countries around the world, Sri Lanka, and all over. Exactly, as you say, you look at the stats and be really surprised, at who's listening and how far they go, because we don't kind of advertise in those countries or anything. So it's essentially a global medium, but it's also, in this context, it's intensely local, isn't it? I mean, although it's a large area, it's very kind of local to that region and its preoccupations. And as you say, it's going on in lots of places everywhere. So that is a bit different. I think the media discourse about podcasting is kind of all around the way that it replaces bits of mainstream media, so radio is now getting taken over by podcasting. You certainly see this with the BBC. The election night coverage this year was full of podcasters up there, people like from The Rest is Politics and so on, rather than usual presenters. And we do tend to focus on those that have massive numbers, like, in our own sector, kind of David James, for instance, people like that. But, there is a very long tail, and your work is really pointing this up, that it can speak directly to not only to a global audience, but it can speak to very specific localized regional audiences as well. Sorry, there isn't a question in there, but how would you reflect on that?
Yeah, I think that was something, while doing this research, I just didn't have an answer for in anticipation of what that was going to be in terms of these podcasters' audiences. And I think at first, when I'm looking at dominant narratives, such as this huge stereotype, I was grandiose with it. And I thought, okay, how is this changing the world? And then when I realized, they're kind of podcasting for local areas, for relatively smaller areas, I felt first like, oh, okay, so it's small. But then I think that's quite beautiful, because it's a drop in the ocean and it's a ripple effect that then changes the narrative. It has to start with you, and it has to start in your own community. And Appalachia as a region has been broken and hurt, and is disconnected from the U.S. and disconnected from itself. So the fact that they're podcasting for, their local region means that the narrative people can be equipped with, a pride in Appalachia, a pride in their identity, and then they can take that out. And it starts small and it gets big in terms of changing these narratives and shifting these narratives to reflect more these real counter stories, these real stories that people are actually experiencing in Appalachia. So and yeah, like you said, you have the odd listener, you have people in all other countries too, which is not insignificant. That ripple effect, that's that feeling it. And when you can see that people are listening to your podcast across the world, and it's incredible, the listenership that you can gather from podcasting. So it is a really powerful tool in that way.
People in the audience may be wondering, our listeners here may be wondering when we were going to get around to talking about learning. I mean, in a sense, we've been talking about learning all the way through this, what you've learned and, what I'm learning as I listen to you actually about podcasting. If we kind of shift that to looking at the organizational context, for instance? Kind of a region like Appalachia is very specific, a practice area, like kind of, medical practice areas, law, building, logistics, defense, whatever. Those are all really quite localized because the audience is self-selecting. You can talk to a very specific subset of a largely global audience through podcasting in a way that broadcast media finds it rather difficult to address, I think. So, I mean, that is interesting. What does your work, particularly this work, tell you about the use of podcasts as a learning medium specifically?
Yeah, I mean, podcasts have greatly changed the landscape of learning. Just the fact that you can access it so easily. And that's something, with my work with Assemble U too, that's one of our angles is it's so accessible. You can listen to it on your own. You have more agency when you have podcasts. I use a podcast as learning because you can take your dog for a walk. You can, make a meal. It's just good in terms of using your time wisely, but it's also changing, it's helping change learning because, again, podcasting kind of inherently is spontaneous and there's some structure, right? Sometimes more structure than others, but it's candid conversation and it's rewiring how we think about learning. So much learning is inaccessible. There's a paywall. You have to go to university. You have to do this. You have to have this, be of this certain kind of caliber of a person. When in reality, you can access podcasting and learn so much. And you can also hear these candid conversations and storytelling. And that's sometimes more valuable than a textbook, more valuable than getting a certificate is hearing real life experiences. So it's restructuring the way we learn because it's so accessible. You can listen to it anywhere. And it's changing the way we think of learning material. Conversations are and storytelling is an incredible learning tool and an incredible way to shift perspectives. And and you form this parasocial kind of relationship sometimes with a podcaster. If you're listening to them regularly, you also do form a connection and you also then practice active listening, which is such an important part of learning is being able to actively listen, really hone your attention in, and pay attention is important. So I think podcasting is just fantastic for learning.
I feel I ought to offer a kind of counter narrative, as it were, on the accessibility front, because one of the things that is a bit weird with podcasts for learning, particularly that you'll have come across, of course, is that the beauty of podcasts is their accessibility. You just pick up your phone, here's the new episode for the rest of its history or whatever it is, and you log on and walk the dog or fold your laundry or whatever you're doing. However, in the organizational context, you might have to access it through an LMS, and there it becomes slightly difficult. You have to wrap it in a SCORM package. It doesn't automatically come to you on your device. You have to go through the LMS to get to it. The whole kind of logic of learning systems isn't set up for the kind of fluidity and intimacy in terms of a user experience that podcasts give us. In conversations with Adam, of course, I found that he's established a way of getting around this with sort of private podcast feeds. So you can have all of that you get with a publicly available podcast, but in a private for your organization only feed and so on. So there are ways of getting around that, but it seems that is something to get around in terms of access. So do you want to talk a bit about podcasting as alert? I think there's so much to say about this. I think there's a lot of unexploited potential, or currently unexploited potential. It's very fast growing. Assemble U is a fast growing company in the use of organizational learning and education. But also, how do you see the way that podcasting as a well-known medium is coming into the organizational context and having to deal with those delivery problems?
Yeah, that connects well so I'm new within L&D and new within the kind of organizational podcast sphere. So it's been really interesting to learn as I go with Assemble U of how podcasting looks different in this sphere. But it connects back to my research question that I struggled with a lot, is the question of curation. While I say there's candid conversation, spontaneity in podcasting, there's still a hand in someone is editing, someone is, making it less accessible in that way. Someone's injecting their own narratives within it. And then in an organizational sense, there's someone who might be in charge of choosing which podcasts, which learning material that then, their company of 500 people have. So there's somebody, that has kind of that power. And there's also, it can be a lack of accessibility in terms of there's not enough time to listen to it, or other things like that. So it's a hard balance, I think, to strike in terms of how much do you, in the organizational side of things, I'm still getting familiar with in terms of looking at it through L&D. Does that answer the question? Can you remind me again what you were asking?
I asked a rather confused question. I'm sorry that. I think one was about the kind of difficulties that you encounter as you bring podcasting into the organizational context. And I think you've probably answered that it's something you're encountered and learning around. I think the other one is about the fantastic potential for podcasting within the learning context. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think especially as technology is moving at a rapid pace, I think there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding and an overwhelmingness in terms of how can where do I fit? Where do I exist in this fast changing landscape? And how do I still prioritize myself? How do I, expand myself as a human while doing my job well and, living within this organization? I think podcasting has huge potential because you can, again, candidly kind of address these through conversation. And podcasting can look so many different ways. There's so many different formats. There's, formulas out there too of different ways to do it. You can have, for example, in an organization, you can do interview style podcasts with different people within it. You can have an interview with, your HR person, and that could be a whole podcast episode. You can have an interview with your accountant, and that could be a whole episode. And it's a way to get to know your organization, even just to make almost virtual introductions. Say, hey, listen to your podcast episode. And if you're in a big organization, that's a fantastic way to make everybody more accessible, make everybody more approachable, get to know people on an actual individual level. So that's just one method that podcasting could be used in. And that in turn, you might think, well, what does that mean for learning? But you're learning about a person, and that candid conversation, you're learning about the role. Then you're in turn learning about, okay, well then how do I function within my organization? What role do I play? And that's really important things to address. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's another point there, which, I'm coming from a slightly different perspective in having done the Great Minds on Learning Theory series with Donald, and but also doing consulting work now with organizations who want to use podcasting for learning. There is a thing in digitizing learning that the role of SMEs comes up again and again, and various people like Mayer and I think Daniel Kahneman talk about this, that experts are very bad at conveying their expertise to people who are just beginning in that field because they don't know what they don't know. And Mayer, I think, Mayer recommends interviewing several different SMEs rather than relying on one for particularly that reason. And there's a difficulty about getting the knowledge out of the experts' heads into those of trainees, given those difficulties. One of the ways that you can do that, of course, is to interview them. A good interviewer can make things much more transparent for knowing their audience and being able to say, well, what exactly you mean by that? Sorry, take us back a bit and give us a context for what you're saying. And so on. That's an enormously valuable potential role for for podcasting in there, where organisations are full of expertise that they can't necessarily unlock, and it isn't always easy to convert it into content because the SMEs tell them to put too much in,
Right.
and so on. These are complaints, we've heard very much over the years. Can we talk a bit more specifically now about your role at Assemble U? What's your actual job there, and what are your hopes for that? What do you want to do with it?
Yeah, so with Assemble U, I'm the content coordinator. So I'm helping with a lot of different projects. One thing I do help with is the L&D Challenges podcast that Adam Lacey runs. So I'm helping with a lot of post-production. So after the fact of kind of editing and setting it up so we can get it online and send it out. And as well as helping with some other projects, such as we're creating, kind of learning materials about Microsoft and PowerPoint. And we'll be getting those out soon too. So helping produce those and make sure everything aligns with that. So it's exciting. I've been there 3 weeks now, so I'm getting my sea legs still with it, but it's a fantastic team, and I'm really excited to be working alongside Adam and everybody else at Assemble U.
Yeah, I'm going to do something shameless now and take credit for having introduced you to Adam.
You're allowed. You were the connection there. Yep. Yeah,
but don't worry, folks at Blue Eskimo. I'm not trying to replace you as a recruitment consultant. That's not really my job. So lastly, what is the best way for people to follow your thinking and activities? I thought the Appalachian project was just so interesting, and it's interesting to see what else you'll be doing and talking about and thinking about in the future. How can people best follow you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn. Just Brigid McCormack at LinkedIn. You can connect with me or follow me there. I took a break from podcasting, and since it was such a deep dive of a project on Appalachia and podcasting, I think no podcasting for me right now. But maybe in the future, I'll pick that back up and continue exploring it. So LinkedIn is the best way to see if I do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the field needs. God knows there's enough people podcasting. Everyone's got a bloody podcast.
Right.
But it does need kind of knowledgeable and interesting people like yourself in it, I think. And we're all the better for having you there. And I'm very glad you're working with Assemble U, who a really interesting company. Thank you very much for your time today, Brigid. I'd like to take more time. We've got to keep these things to a reasonable length. And if people have any questions about what you said, I hope they'll send those through to us via LinkedIn and perhaps Twitter. We're still going to use that.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. I'm always excited to talk about my research, so I appreciate you letting me chat about it.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to our sponsors. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review, and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
The Learning Hack is among the top 5% of shows most listened to globally, according to Listen Notes. And if you think your organisation could benefit from sponsoring the Learning Hack, or from using our knowledge and resources to start your own learning podcasts, you can contact me on john@learninghackpodcasts.com. Until next time.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.